So our title again for this month is In the Desert, Understanding Lent. So in the desert, I need to start by clarifying sort of what exactly that means. Because obviously the desert can be a place of great beauty. I know some people who intentionally travel to different deserts to see the differences and explore their beauty, but for our purposes this month, we are using the image of a desert to describe times in our life when we feel dry or when we feel empty. Desert times, hard times that we go through. And so I want to start by pulling out some of the characteristics of what a desert time in your life might look like. So the first is that when you're in the desert, you may feel alone. When we're in the desert, we often feel like no one understands, right? No one understands what I'm going through. Or I have no one to talk to about this, even God. I don't even feel like God is there. Those times when maybe we pick up the phone and we feel like there's no one I can call. And so you feel alone in the desert. Similarly, in the desert, you might feel that your needs are not being met. Sometimes that can be physical needs. That could be your need for food or your need for shelter. But it can also be emotional and spiritual needs. It could be things like the need to be loved. You might be in the desert and you feel like no one loves me. Or the need to be known. That's a really big one that I find in people. We have this innate desire to be known. And sometimes in the desert we're thinking, no one really knows who I am. In the desert we often feel like there's no end in sight. Right? You look ahead and you look behind you and all you see is the desert. All you see is the pain that you're in now. And you can't imagine a time beyond that. And so often the desert can be a place of great despair when we're in the desert. And we're experiencing these things. We feel lost. And so I want to share with you one desert experience from my life, which happened when I first moved to New Hampshire. So about a year and a half ago. Obviously, I love this beautiful state that I now get to live in, and I love the job that I have here that brought me here. But when I first moved here, I didn't know anyone. I moved to the state away from my friends and my family, and I didn't know a soul here. And so in my first couple months, I very much felt that I was in the desert. I felt empty. I felt dry. Night after night, I was home in my apartment alone, and I felt like there was no one around that I could talk to, and I felt that distance between my loved ones and I. In terms of needs unmet, I was just saying that need to be known felt so empty within me because I thought, nobody knows me here. And if they don't know me, how can they really care about me? And I couldn't imagine a time when I would ever feel at home in a place that was so different. And last night I was joking about how I could never feel at home in a place without a Trader Joe's. But they're opening one, so anyway. But anyway, that was just one of several what I would call desert times in my life. And it probably wasn't even one of the worst, but it was a hard time that I felt empty and dry. And I think that we all have these moments in our lives, these desert times. And there isn't always a rhyme or a reason as to why they come up. Sometimes there is. Sometimes you move to a new state and you don't know anyone. Sometimes you lose a job or you lose someone you love. But sometimes nothing changes and yet you find yourself in the desert. And sometimes it's a spiritual desert. Sometimes it's a spiritual dryness that we experience. Mother Teresa, a saint now, an amazing woman in the church, she always talked about the spiritual dryness that she struggled with. And St. John of the Cross coined a phrase, the dark night of the soul. And so there are times when our souls are in the desert and they feel this emptiness and this dryness. And so we need to be aware that this happens. That this happens throughout our lives. And so we need to prepare for them. And so today what we're going to do is we are going to look to the scriptures, to those who have quite literally been in the desert before us, and see what we can learn from them. So we're going to start with the Israelites in the desert. And so to give you a little backstory before we dive into Exodus, Joseph. Joseph is a character in the Old Testament that you've probably heard of. He has a Technicolor dream coat. No, he doesn't. That's a play. But he did have a coat. Anyway, but Joseph and his brothers do not get along. They do not get along at all. His brothers are envious of him. They hate him. And they ultimately sell him into slavery in Egypt. To cut a long story short, Joseph rises to power in Egypt because God is with him. And ultimately, a famine comes over all the land, and Egypt does well because God prepared Joseph. And the land where his family is, where his brothers are, does not, and they're starving. So his brothers come to Egypt, and there's, again, to cut a long story short, there's a beautiful reconciliation. And because of the famine, the people of God, who had been over here, all moved to Egypt. And they stay there in Egypt. And God's people grow and multiply and become great in the land of Egypt. And everything's good for a while until a new Pharaoh comes into power. One who didn't know Joseph and who was threatened by this great people that were living in his land. And so he enslaved them. And we read about how the Israelites were miserable in slavery until, Moses comes around. And there's the story of the plagues and Moses' whole let my people go. And that's all I'm going to say, not any more than that. But we know that Moses gets the Pharaoh to release the Israelites. They dramatically cross through the Red Sea, which is divided, and they make their way into freedom. So that about brings us to where we are here in Exodus, where the people of God are freed from slavery. They're heading out into the desert to a land that God has promised them, a land that he describes as flowing with milk and honey, which I always say sounds terrible because I'm allergic to dairy. But to them it was apparently very good. And so they're on their way to this promised land, led by Moses and his brother Aaron, who was a priest. And at this excerpt that we're going to read, they're fairly early into their time in the desert. Hasn't been forever. It's pretty early into that journey. So we're going to dive in. And we read in Exodus, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." And so there's a couple things I want to pull out from this excerpt. The first just being that the Israelites here were just beginning their desert period, and they already wanted to turn back. They already wanted to return to slavery, to something bad, rather than endure through. And I think we look at that and we think they're crazy, right? Like, you were going to go back to slavery rather than keep going. But I also can see how this plays out in lives of people I know. That this can be kind of relatable. The example that came to mind for me first was friends of mine who have been in bad relationships. And they're in the relationship and then they end it and they get out, but then they get lonely. Or they start to think, oh, what if I never find someone else? And so they go back to a bad situation rather than pushing on to something that could be better ahead. And the second thing I want to talk about is that despite the fact that God had rescued them from slavery, despite the fact that he had literally parted a sea and done these incredible things, they didn't trust that he was going to take care of them. Right? He had shown how he had taken care of them, and yet here we see that they don't trust that he will provide. And we know the full story, so we know that he does. He makes manna fall from heaven. And there's some quail that come up too, so that they don't starve. They are well fed. But how quickly they forgot the way that God took care of them. And so we're going to keep following the Israelites to the book of Numbers. And to give a little more backstory, so they continue on their journey through the desert. And they eventually reach the promised land. So they've reached the edges of the land that God had promised. But when they get there, there's people in it. So they weren't expecting that. They show up and there's people in it. And I think right there's a bit of a lesson for us that sometimes we get to the thing it is that God has promised us, but it's not what we were expecting. And it throws us off. And so we read that they say this. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." They were so close to what they had been promised, but they wanted to return to a lesser good. They were so close to something amazing, and yet they wanted to turn back. And despite the lesson they had just learned with the manna, they didn't trust that God was going to take care of them once again. And we know the result of this is that they end up wandering in the desert for 40 years, because God says, those of you who doubted me will not get to enter into the promised land. And so looking at the Israelites in the desert and how they respond, I want us to sort of take away 3 things. The first is about that desire to turn around. When we're in the desert, when we're going through a hard time, many of us can feel like, I just want to turn around. And I see this playing out in people's lives really in 2 main ways. One is what I was sort of talking about before, which is settling, right? Instead of pushing through to something that could be amazing, you settle for something less in different ways. And I see this in a lot of my peers, in their careers and relationships, different things, that instead of pushing through the desert, they go back to something less. And the other way I think that we sort of turn around today is that we live in our heads in the past. Instead of pushing through the hard time we're in, we want to live in the past. And I know that I saw this in myself. I think it's pretty common, but when I lost my mom, when she died, I very much was in the desert, and I didn't want to walk forward to a time where she wouldn't be around, and so I was very much sort of living in the past. I think that's pretty common when we lose someone, we do that. But the only time that we actually have is now, and so I had to work to stop living in the past and not turn around, but to keep going. And the second and third thing I want us to take away are pretty similar, right? We look at the Israelites and they see that they don't trust that God will provide for them. And they don't trust in the promises of God.
What happened?
And we look at their story and we're like, you guys are crazy. He split a sea and then you think he's going to let you starve, you know? How quickly they forget the lesson that God keeps teaching them. And so I think it's easy for us to be like, shame on you, how could you do that? But when I look at my own life, I realize I do that far more often than I realize. So to tell one embarrassing story about me, when I was out of college and I didn't have a job, I was really freaking out. I was watching all of my friends getting jobs, and I was so discouraged and I was frustrated. And I always did very well academically in school, and I did not understand what God was doing at all. And we would have these fights where I was basically throwing a temper tantrum, like, what are you doing to me? You know, I thought you were going to guide me, and I had opportunities that I really thought was what he was calling me to, and then they would fall through, and I would temper tantrum some more, and I was like, what are you doing? I'm so frustrated. How are you not showing me the way? And I did not trust, and I was trying to take matters into my own hands. And in a really amazing story that if you ever want to hear, I love to tell it, this incredible job here sort of dropped into my lap. It's really amazing on both sides how it just worked out perfectly. And there were so many things that could have come between it, but didn't. And so this amazing job that is like, I couldn't have dreamed this up at that time if I tried, fell into my lap, and here I am. And I remember being like, God, I am so sorry. How could I have doubted you? You guided me. This is amazing. And then I realized, oh, I got a job in New Hampshire. I need to move. And so I started looking for an apartment, and the apartment situation is not great in New Hampshire. And I start freaking out. I'm like, God, what are you doing? I'm going to be homeless. And I'm on the phone with my dad, and I spent all these nights just like a wreck with anxiety. And once again, God was very gracious to me and did put an amazing apartment into my lap that I still live in today. But I completely forgot that he had just taken care of me. You know, and the point isn't that God is always going to give us what we're seeking and what we're asking for, but that we so quickly forget. I so quickly forgot how he had guided me into this job and just completely let it go. So I think it's easy for us to look at them and think, how would you do that? But I see how I do it in my own life. And so we're going to continue on and look to another example of how to act when we're in the desert. And we're going to look to the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. We actually read this last week at Mass, so it might sound familiar for guidance on how our Lord behaved in the desert. So to give a little backstory again, this is a lot shorter, but Jesus at the start of his ministry went into the desert for 40 days. And so in the Gospel of Luke, we read this. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. Makes sense. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, 'Man shall not live on bread alone.'" The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, 'Worship the Lord your God and serve him only.'" The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here. For it is written, 'He will command his angels concerning you, to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in your hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone.'" Jesus answered, "It is said, 'Do not put the Lord your God to the test.'" When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. And so in Jesus, we see an example of how to respond when we're in the desert. Because even when his needs were not being met, right, he was hungry. Even when he was all alone in this temptation and frustration, he doesn't turn around, right? He doesn't give up. He keeps going. He doesn't doubt that God will provide. He doesn't doubt the promises that God has made. He clung to his faith in God. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, when talking about this passage, refers us to the book of Hebrews, which says this: "For we have not a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sinning." What Jesus had, but the Israelites didn't, and what we're called to is that endurance to keep going through the desert. Endurance to just keep taking another step as we continue walking. Because desert times arise in all of our lives, and we don't know when they're going to come about. But I want to switch gears for a second and talk about Lent. So Lent is the 40 days between Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. So we're a little bit into it now. And about Lent, the Catechism says, "By the solemn 40 days of Lent, the Church unites herself each year to the mystery of Jesus in the desert." And so during Lent, we join with the 40 years of the Israelites. And we join with the 40 days of Jesus. And we walk out into the desert. And so Lent is what I'm calling an intentional desert time. It's a time when we intentionally put ourselves in the desert. The Catechism uses the phrase voluntary self-denial. Voluntary self-denial. We go without during Lent, and we give more during Lent. It's during the season of Lent that we practice for the real desert times in our lives. We practice for the ones that will come up and we don't know when. And we grow from inflicting ourselves and putting ourselves in that desert. And so to try to explain that a little more, I'm going to tell another embarrassing story from my life, which is about Ash Wednesday last year. So I didn't grow up in a family that practiced all of the different Lenten practices and the different Lenten disciplines. So it wasn't until last year, when I moved up here and started working here, that I knew that we were called to fast on Ash Wednesday. So in case any of you are in the same boat like me, just to tell you what we are asked to do, you're asked to not snack in between meals. And then you are supposed to have 2 small meals and 1 meal that does not exceed the size of the 2 small meals combined. Sort of a little formula there. But basically you're not eating very much on Ash Wednesday. And so last year was my first year doing it, and I made a fatal mistake that I hope none of you made this year, but I'll give you a warning for next year. And that is that I ate my larger meal for lunch. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. So I had my larger meal for lunch, and I had something at the church that night, but it was done pretty early, so I was home by about 7:30. So I had a good chunk of time before I was going to bed, and I was hungry. I just had this tiny dinner, and so I was feeling very hungry. And so I'm in my apartment, right? And I live by myself. So I'm sort of like, no one's gonna know, you know? Like, no one's gonna know if I eat a few crackers. And then I start thinking to myself, like, look it up, I'm like, we're good, right? Like, you don't care if I eat a few crackers. Like, I feel like we have a pretty good relationship. I don't really see how me eating a banana is gonna affect our relationship. And so it got to a point where I'm literally sort of like pacing back and forth in front of the pantry in my apartment, where I'm like, well, no one will know, but I will know. And like, but we're good, but I said I would, you know? And so I'm walking back and forth, and I'm getting so frustrated, and I'm hungry, and finally I just was like, oh, the only way that I am going to get through this is with you, God. And it was like a light bulb just like appeared over my head, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's the whole point. You know, the only way that I could get through it is with God, and that's the whole point of Lent, is that we put ourselves in the desert so that the only way we are going to get through it is with the help of God. And so I want to end our time together by sharing a quote with you that I happened upon as I was preparing for this teaching that really moved me, and I think speaks well to why we would put ourselves in the desert. And it's by a Christian counselor and author, Dan Allender, and it says this: "The desert shatters the soul's arrogance and leaves body and soul crying out in thirst and hunger. In the desert, we trust God or die." And so with that, I will send you to your second discussion. Alright, so we're going to just finish up our time together, as we always do, with getting a little practical. And we're going to talk about how to live the 3 pillars of Lent. So the word Lent actually means spring, which is awesome because Lent for us happens as we're adjusting to springtime. These last few warm days have been so nice. I don't trust that they're going to last, but it's been nice. But Lent means spring, and so Lent gives us a fresh start. And so that's what I want to give you today. Regardless of how past Lents have gone, even regardless of how the past week and a half have gone, you have a fresh start from this point on to do what you'd like to do with your Lent. And so we're going to look at the 3 different pillars of Lent, starting with prayer. And we're going to try and look at them maybe from a slightly different angle than what you typically hear. So the first pillar of Lent is prayer. And so the question I want to pose to you is, what is one additional practice that God is calling you to add to your prayer life? So if your prayer life you feel like has sort of fallen away, it could just be, okay, I'm going to restart and redevelop my prayer life. But if you have something that you're doing, Lent isn't necessarily when you swap out what you're already doing, but you add something additional, right? If you just swap, it's not as much of a sacrifice. So we're called to do something else. And what that will be will depend on you and what you need in your life and what God is calling you to. Maybe you need to spend more time in the scriptures. Maybe you need to go for walks with God, you know? It could be so many different things. But what is that one additional thing that God might be calling you to this Lent? The second pillar of Lent is fasting. Fasting, which we typically just think of in terms of giving something up. But the way I want to ask it today is, what is something in your life that keeps you from God? That sort of pops up and keeps you, which comes between you and God, or keeps you from being the best version of yourself. So I'm just going to use myself as an example because I think it illustrates it well. So I live alone, and it's quiet a lot, and I don't like that. So I put Netflix on in the background a lot. And so I have decided to fast from Netflix for Lent, which means that it's quiet a lot. But my thought was that God speaks to us in silence, right? He speaks, and there could be things that he's trying to say to me, or work he's trying to do on me that I'm missing because I'm watching like a sitcom through for like the 5th time while I'm washing dishes. So now it's quiet while I'm washing dishes, and it's hard, but it's this idea that I was like, this might be coming between me and God, and this might be preventing me from being the best version of myself. So really trying to think, what are the things in my life that I need to give up, or I need to take a little big break from? Not necessarily just the first thing that comes to mind that might be a challenge, although it might be that. And the third pillar is almsgiving. And so we know almsgiving is giving, but it's a little more than that in that it's sacrificial giving. It's giving in a way that's a bit uncomfortable. So whether that's treasure, whether that's money, and you're going to sort of give in a way that you're like, ooh, that kind of hurts. But that could also be time. A lot of times it's easier for us to give our money, and it's harder for us to give our time. So maybe it's giving more of your time in a way that's a little bit inconvenient. And it can also be talent. We typically say time, talent, and treasure. But giving of yourself in a way that is a challenge for you or is a bit uncomfortable. So these are the 3 pillars that we're called to practice in some way during Lent. And I want to add a couple things that Father Mike talks about in one of his videos. And they're sort of lovingly harsh reminders about what the 3 pillars of Lent are not. And so the first thing that these are not is these are not a New Year's resolution. And thank goodness for that, because none of us keep New Year's resolutions, right? So this is not something that you're like, I have looked at my life and I want to change this, so I'm going to take it on. It's sort of a little bit different than that. It's a bit more involving God and your spiritual life. Similarly, it's not really killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Father Mike warns us against doing something along the lines of, well, I've been meaning to tidy up, so for Lent, I'm going to, give 40 things away. I don't know. That was just an idea. And maybe God is genuinely calling you to tidy your life, to simplify your life. But that's not really the point, to just do something you already were planning on doing. So this is not the time to be like, well, I've been meaning to work out more, so for Lent I'm going to work out, And again, maybe that's what God is calling you to. Maybe He's saying, I really want you to commit to making your body healthier or something. But it's not really supposed to be that killing 2 birds with 1 stone. And the last thing that it's not, Father Mike tells the story of his sister who gave up watermelon for Lent in Minnesota in the winter. So they're not supposed to be irrelevant or easy, right? So every now and then you hear of someone giving something up and you're like, what difference is that going to make? So it's really supposed to be something that challenges us, not something irrelevant and easy to our lives. So it's not too late. There's plenty of Lent left. If you want to tweak what you're doing, add something, and if you have a practice that you've been doing, we'll be praying for you. These things can be hard. 40 days is a lot longer than it seems. I miss Netflix, so we'll pray for each other and we'll make it through this Lent together. So, thank you all for this time that we've had together. I'm going to switch my hats and just have a couple announcements, and then I'll bring up our witness for the evening. So, I have 3 papers up here that I'll pass out at the end of our time together, but just to quickly tell you what they are. Michelle put together family activity sheets. So there's 40 Lenten activities for Catholic families. So I will go around with these, and 1 per family, and you can take your kids and do some fun stuff. So that's those. I have the summary sheets that I typically make, which have some of the quotes and different points from the talk we just went over, if you want to grab one of these. And then finally, last month, I announced this, but just in case you weren't here or you've forgotten, there's these parenting workshops coming up that the Diocese and St. Marie's are putting on next weekend. And it's about parenting in the digital age, how to navigate that with kids, specifically sort of talking about pornography and how the exposure for that, the age has just dropped, and how to talk about that with your kids. And it's such a hard thing, because kids come across something and they think they're going to get in trouble. And so anyway, there's 2 different workshops coming up next weekend. If you want one of these, either come get it or grab one. I'll drop a couple of them by, but I did give them out last month, so you might have one. Okay, and then I have 3 announcements. We are looking for some volunteers here at the church, and so I want to just throw these 3 things out there to you. We really are looking for people who are like, yes, I really feel like God is calling me to this. So this is not me pressuring you at all, but just in case something pricks your heart, I want you to know that there are these opportunities for service available. The first is that Marie DeRoja, Deacon Winton's wife, is launching with some others a vocations ministry. So they're going to be promoting opportunities to explore religious vocations, marriage, different things. So they're sort of trying to get this off the ground, and they're looking for others who can maybe help them create this ministry. So if that's something you're passionate about or that's on your heart, you could contact myself or Marie or directly, and we will get you hooked up. So that's one. Two, we are working at Christ the King. It's been on the minds of people here for a while on a hospitality ministry. So that would be people to greet at Mass. And what we're looking for is not greeters. So if you're willing to do that, that's awesome, but hold tight. We're actually looking for people who want to help launch that. So coordinators, people who can oversee it and make sure everything's good. So if you have those that skill set, and that's something you're passionate about, again, you can contact myself or any one of us and we will get you hooked up. But it's not that greeter position at that time, it's coordinators. And then finally, there are some opportunities for service in childcare here. They were in the bulletin this week, but they're looking for childcare for Alpha and the Alpha that's coming up, and also for the nursery, and it pays. So if you're looking for a little extra money, or you have a teenager or a young adult who's looking for a little extra money, I'm still considering it. There's some opportunities for childcare there, and children are the best. So, all right. Those are all my announcements. So, without further ado, I will bring up John Mullen, who's going to be speaking to us.
Guys, who's that? I guess weird. Okay. Let's around a little bit. So, I was asked to do this to talk about a little bit about my time in the desert, and I'm actually still there. My name is John Mullen. I know some of you guys, but for those of you I don't know, I go to the 11 o'clock Mass, and now we know each other, so hello. If you see me at 11 o'clock, say hello. See me out for coffee, say hello. And I will too. So I don't have a ton of time to talk about this. I practiced this, and I got it down to like 10 minutes to 8 minutes to 7 minutes. I got it down to 5 minutes, so let's give it a try here. I'm going to talk about how I got to the desert. What I've experienced and what I've learned in the desert, and like a true, in true businessman sense, what I seek to accomplish here in the desert. So basically, just for contextual reasons, I'm not going to get really into it. How I got into the desert, about a year and a half ago, I got diagnosed with a neurological disorder that basically disabled me, ended my career. With a company for 13 years, hopefully temporarily. Turned life upside down pretty good. And then shortly after getting diagnosed with that, my sister died. Which was terrible. Died of suicide. Tough story. My mom's here with me tonight. So, really challenging. So, hey, I'm in the desert. Pretty understandable how somebody could get to the desert after having a life turned upside down. And so you find yourself in the desert, and all of a sudden you're asking those familiar questions. Questions like, "Why me, God?" I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I've checked most of the boxes so far in my life. I've done a pretty good job. I'm not perfect, but I feel like I've done what you've asked me to do. So why me? And then when that didn't get answered, why aren't you listening? And are you there? Are you there at all? And then that feeling of abandonment kind of sets in. And it's like, am I abandoned? And so just like we're talking about today, which it's amazing watching the preparation for this today, because I'm sitting there going, this is like the exact same thing that I wrote. So there's a familiarity here, so that anytime that happens, I know that I think I'm on the right track, because it comes from another place, right? So I'm sitting there and I'm asking myself these questions, and this feeling of abandonment. And it was at my sister's funeral. My father asked me to read from the book of Job. And the book of Job is another great story from Scripture, thousands of years ago. A guy who also checked all the boxes and did a pretty good job in life found himself asking God, why me? And he asked all these questions. Have you abandoned me? But the one thing that Job said at the end of it that I hadn't done is he said, it's your will. You know what you're doing. I don't know what you're doing. But if this is the way you want it, then I will do it gladly. And that got him through a lot, far more than I've gone through, certainly. And it really intrigued me, and it touched me, because to me, the idea of, hey, I don't need to know why all these things are happening. And better, maybe it's not God that's doing this to me, that maybe it's just the circumstances that, is a confluence between circumstance and just the rules of time coming together. There's really nothing to do with God, it's just where I am. And I don't need to worry about that, and I don't need to ask why, because God has a will. And so therefore, my whole concern with my purpose, I guess that doesn't matter either. But it really wasn't enough. I mean, it was interesting. So if we follow the whole desert analogy, I'm sitting there in a cave and I find this book of a guy who passed before me and seemed to find a way out. So I searched for more things like that, specifically in Scripture. I went in, I read the Psalms, I read the Gospels, I read things from the saints, the doctors of the church, all these people that have gone before me, all these people who have gone through personal experiences in the desert and found their way out. And I felt a lot of relief in knowing that, hey, I guess there is a way, but I still kind of felt that separation from God. And finally, what I was able to do is, in seeing it, I wanted to search God out. So I stopped estranging myself. We talked about that today. It's the idea that, hey, you're in the worst possible space in your life, so why don't you help yourself out and just go hang out by yourself and don't go to anybody that loves you and is willing to help you. So I reached back out to those people. I came back to my church community, my family community, my friend community. And in that, you can see God. But even there, I hungered for it more. And finally, I turned to prayer. And I realized that my time in the desert went far beyond a year and a half ago. It had gone on for years and years and years. And somewhere along the way, somewhere along the perfect life that I was living before, I forgot how to pray. And I sat there in prayer, half prayer, half meditation. Meditation was great. I got to learn that with all my neurological therapy. So I mixed the two together, and I went to prayer, and I put myself under a tree in front of Jesus. I've never in my life pictured myself in front of Jesus. In fact, I've never in my life pictured Jesus. And I have a pretty creative mind. I'm a writer, but I could never do that. It just terrified me, honestly. I love him, but it's just, again, it's just a point of separation. But I put myself in front of him. There he is. Red robe, smiling like he knows something that I don't know. And I immediately fall prostrate. Even in my own fantasy, I am not worthy, right? And he says to me in a very clear voice, after he puts his hand on the back of my neck, which is something my wife does to comfort me, and it's very comfortable. He says, I am always with you. And I looked up to see him, but he wasn't there. And he said, whether you see me or not. And it gave me chills. Kind of like chills I got right now. And then to authenticate what he said, he told me something that I really wasn't expecting. And he said, but you need to learn to suffer with dignity. And I immediately snapped myself out of myself. What does that mean? But as I kind of pondered it and thought about it more, it made a ton of sense. It was that whole bit about obedience. Obedience to the will of God. He wasn't asking me to suffer. He was acknowledging that I'm suffering. He was just saying, you got to do it with dignity because I'm with you always, whether you see me or not. And if that's the case, and you know that, you really got nothing to worry about. And I'll be honest with you, the desert's beautiful. I hope I'm out of it someday. I prefer greener pastures for sure. And I have no clue what my purpose is anymore. But I think it's okay. And I'm just going to keep walking. And because God's with me. And I know that I can go there. And I know that I can come here. And I know that I can go to my family. And I know that I can go to my friends. And I know that I can look at the writing on the cave walls. All the people that came before me. And if that's all I got, I think I'm all right. And so for all of you here that are in the desert, and I would say that most of you probably are, because I think our life is a desert. Think about those things. There's people that went before you that knew how to do it. There's people around you that want to nurture you. There's people that need to be nurtured by you, and turn to your prayer. Because God's there, and he's there whether you see him or not.